The late summer wind swept across the sun-bleached prairie grass outside Pueblo, carrying with it the acrid smell of gun smoke that Luke Carter couldn't seem to wash from his uniform. 3 days had passed since he'd deserted his Union regiment, the weight of too many senseless deaths finally breaking his resolve. His Confederate-issued boots, stripped from a dead soldier months ago, had carried him far from the blood-soaked battlefields of the East. But the memories followed like persistent shadows. Through his brass spyglass, Luke observed the scattered Lakota camp nestled in a protected valley, counting at least 30 hide-covered teepees arranged in the traditional circle. He'd been tracking their movements for 2 days, desperate for food but unsure of his welcome. The tribal scouts had surely spotted him by now, though they gave no indication. His stomach cramped painfully, reminding him that pride wouldn't fill it. Among the teepees, he spotted a figure who didn't move like the others. Another white man, dressed in buckskins rather than traditional Lakota garments. Through the spyglass, Luke watched him speaking with a group of warriors, gesturing animatedly. The man's presence gave Luke hope that perhaps these people might not immediately kill a stranger. With trembling legs, he began his careful descent into the valley. Before he'd made it halfway down, 3 mounted warriors appeared silently from behind outcroppings, arrows nocked but not drawn. The lead rider, a powerfully built man with 2 eagle feathers in his hair, raised his hand in greeting rather than threat. "I am Joshua," he said in careful English. "You come alone? No soldiers follow?" His dark eyes studied Luke's ragged uniform with clear suspicion. Luke slowly raised his empty hands. "I'm alone. I left the army. I can't fight for them anymore." The admission felt both treasonous and liberating. "I've been without food for days. I saw your camp and hoped." He let the words trail off, suddenly aware of how presumptuous it was to expect help from people his own government was systematically destroying. The warriors exchanged rapid words in Lakota. Joshua's stern expression softened slightly. "We know of others like you, men who see the wrong in this war. Come. But you will speak with our council first." He gestured for Luke to mount behind one of the other warriors. As they rode toward the camp, Luke noticed more armed men emerging from hidden positions in the landscape. Their tactical placement impressed him. He'd clearly underestimated their defensive preparations. In the camp, Luke met Nathan Hall, the buckskin-clad white man he'd spotted earlier. A former Army scout turned traitor, Nathan had lived with the Lakota for 3 years, serving as interpreter and unofficial diplomat. His weathered face crinkled with sympathy as Luke shared his story with the tribal council, Nathan translating the more complex passages. "The soldiers hunt for deserters nearly as eagerly as they hunt us," observed an elderly council member through Nathan's translation. "This one could bring trouble." Several others nodded in agreement, but Joshua spoke up in Luke's defense, describing how openly he had approached. The debate continued as the sun sank toward the western hills, Luke's fate hanging in the balance. A commotion at the edge of camp interrupted the discussion, riders approaching fast from the south. Joshua and several warriors rushed to meet them while Luke's guards tensed, arrows ready. The arriving party turned out to be a hunting group, but their news was grave. A Union cavalry patrol had been spotted less than 10 miles away, moving methodically through the region. The council's debate shifted from whether to help Luke to how best to conceal him. These people had no reason to risk themselves for him, yet they didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he found himself being hustled into a teepee belonging to Joshua's family, his uniform replaced with Lakota clothing. The council had made their choice. They would shelter him, but he would need to earn their trust. As night fell, Luke lay sleepless on a buffalo robe, listening to the soft sounds of the camp. Outside, he could hear Joshua posting guards, their movements precise and coordinated. Despite his exhaustion, Luke's military mind was already analyzing their defensive positions, noting ways they could be improved. Perhaps he had something to offer these people after all, if they would let him teach them what he knew about modern warfare. The next morning brought Eleanor, Joshua's wife, offering him a bowl of rich buffalo stew. Her eyes held none of the hostility he might have expected, only quiet assessment as she watched him eat. Through Nathan's translation, she explained that she had lost 2 brothers to army campaigns. "Yet here you are," she said simply, "turning away from that path. The spirits work in strange ways." Luke spent the next days learning the rhythms of the camp, watching how the Lakota moved with practiced efficiency through their daily tasks. Each morning, he joined Joshua and the hunting parties, studying their methods while discreetly noting potential tactical advantages in the rolling terrain. The endless grass rippled like a bronze ocean, dotted with buffalo wallows and shallow creek beds that could provide excellent cover for warriors. Eleanor proved to be not just Joshua's wife, but also the tribe's healer, and Luke found himself assisting her as she gathered medicinal plants along the creek banks. Through Nathan's patient translation, she taught him the properties of various herbs while subtly evaluating his character. Her quiet strength reminded him of his sister Caroline back in Durango, and the thought sent an ache through his chest. Word came through their scouts that a cavalry patrol was moving through the region, supposedly tracking deserters but also mapping the territory for future operations. Luke recognized the pattern. He'd been part of similar missions before his conscience finally broke. The soldiers would be methodically sweeping through the grasslands, documenting water sources and Native American movements while claiming to pursue other objectives. Joshua called a council meeting in his lodge, the firelight casting dancing shadows as they discussed options. Luke waited until invited to speak, then carefully laid out what he knew of Army procedures. Through Nathan's translation, he explained how patrols typically operated, their likely routes based on terrain, and, most importantly, their vulnerabilities. The warriors listened intently, their faces unreadable in the flickering light. "They will come through this valley within the week," Luke said, sketching a rough map in the dirt floor. "They'll follow the creek, keeping the high ground to their right. Standard procedure." He pointed to a narrow section where the creek bent sharply. "Here, the terrain forces them to bunch up. 12 men, maybe 15. They'll be tired, expecting nothing." Several of the older warriors exchanged meaningful glances. That night, Eleanor brought Luke a bundle of new clothing, beautifully tanned buckskin decorated with careful beadwork. "These belong to my brother," she said through Nathan. "He was built like you." The gift carried heavy meaning, both acceptance and obligation. Luke ran his fingers over the intricate patterns, understanding the weight of trust being placed in him. Over the next few days, Luke worked closely with Joshua and the younger warriors, teaching them the guerrilla tactics he'd learned fighting in the dense forests back east. They were already skilled hunters and trackers. He simply showed them how to apply those same skills against military units. The warriors proved to be quick studies, adapting their traditional techniques to this new type of warfare. Isaac, one of Joshua's most promising young warriors, took particular interest in Luke's lessons about exploiting terrain and using natural features for concealment. The young man had lost family to army campaigns and burned with a controlled fury that Luke recognized from his own war experiences. Together, they scouted the planned ambush site, discussing sightlines and fields of fire in a mix of broken English and sign language. As the predicted day approached, tension in the camp grew. The women prepared extra food and medical supplies while warriors checked weapons and painted their faces. Luke found himself included in their preparations without question now, helping to position warriors in coordinate signals. Eleanor brought him war paint one morning, her eyes serious as she explained the meanings of different patterns. "Through Nathan," she told him, "you choose your path today." The waiting was familiar to Luke, that terrible calm before combat that he'd known too many times before. But this time felt different. He wasn't fighting for some distant cause or politician's agenda. These people had taken him in when he was lost, shown him kindness when they had every reason not to. Now he would help them protect their homes and families. As dawn broke over the prairie, Luke carefully applied the war paint Eleanor had given him, making his choice clear to all. The rising sun cast long shadows across the grass as Luke and Nathan crouched behind a cluster of buffalo berry bushes, watching the trail that wound through the valley below. Through gaps in the foliage, they could see dust clouds rising in the distance, the telltale sign of approaching cavalry. Luke's fingers traced the rough bark of his rifle stock, his war-painted face grim as he calculated distances and angles in his mind. The skills that had once served a different army would now protect these people who had become his family. Nathan touched Luke's arm and pointed to the ridge across the valley, where other warriors waited in position. The morning light caught glimpses of movement, exactly where Luke had suggested they place their fastest riders. The plan was complex, but built on simple principles he'd learned through bitter experience: control the high ground, split the enemy's strength, and strike from multiple directions. The Lakota warriors had absorbed his lessons eagerly, combining his tactical knowledge with their own intimate understanding of the land. Eleanor moved silently through the brush behind them, carrying extra quivers of arrows and powder horns. The autumn wind swept across the plains outside Pueblo, carrying the scent of sage and dried grass as Luke Carter crouched behind a fallen cottonwood, his borrowed Lakota buckskins blending with the muted landscape. 6 months had passed since he deserted the Union Army, finding unlikely sanctuary with the band of Lakota, who now surrounded him in the tall grass. His mentor, Standing Bear, had insisted they learn the white man's tactics of stealth and coordinated assault, seeing in Luke both an ally and a bridge between two worlds. Through his brass spyglass, Luke observed the Federal Cavalry Patrol in the distance. 12 men on horseback, their blue uniforms stark against the golden prairie. Captain Nathan Hall led them, a ruthless commander known for his brutal efficiency in hunting deserters. Luke had served under him before fleeing the senseless slaughter at Antietam. Now Hall's determination to capture him had led to increasingly aggressive incursions into Lakota territory. Beside Luke, young warrior Wild Horse adjusted the captured Springfield rifle in his hands, his eyes narrow with concentration. Like many of the younger Lakota, he'd eagerly embraced Luke's lessons in guerrilla warfare, combining them with traditional hunting skills. The rest of their war party lay hidden in a horseshoe formation around the shallow valley, waiting for Luke's signal. This would be their first major test of the new tactics. The patrol approached the creek crossing where Luke had carefully laid his trap. He'd spent weeks teaching the Lakota how to arrange false trails and use terrain to funnel enemies into killing zones. Captain Hall was following the manufactured signs perfectly, his confidence making him careless. Luke felt a moment's guilt at turning his military training against former comrades, but the Lakota had become his true family now. "Remember," Luke whispered to Wild Horse in halting Lakota, "wait for my shot, then strike like lightning from all sides." The young warrior nodded, passing the message to others nearby. Luke had drilled them relentlessly in coordinated attacks, knowing their success depended on precise timing. His finger tightened on the trigger as the patrol reached the optimal position, bunched together in the creek bed. The crack of Luke's rifle shattered the prairie silence. Captain Hall's lieutenant toppled from his saddle as mounted warriors erupted from the grass on three sides, firing captured Army carbines. The disciplined volley caught the patrol in a deadly crossfire before they could scatter. Luke worked his lever action rapidly, each shot finding its mark as chaos erupted below. Within minutes, it was over. 9 soldiers lay dead or wounded in the creek bed while the survivors fled east toward Pueblo. Captain Hall had escaped, but his patrol was shattered. Luke moved among the fallen with Wild Horse, gathering weapons and ammunition. He knew this victory would change everything. The Lakota had proven they could defeat army units in open combat using modern tactics. That evening, the celebration around the village fires was subdued. While the warriors had acquitted themselves perfectly, Luke sensed an undercurrent of concern. Elder Standing Bear pulled him aside, speaking gravely. "You have given us powerful medicine," the old man said, "but it will bring the bluecoats in greater numbers. We must be prepared." Luke nodded, knowing he'd set events in motion that couldn't be reversed. Word of the ambush spread quickly across the territory. In Pueblo, Eleanor Lopez listened intently as her father Isaac, who ran the general store, discussed it with worried ranchers. The defeat of an army patrol by natives using military tactics was unprecedented. Eleanor found herself wondering about the mysterious white man rumored to be living with the Lakota, teaching them to fight in new ways. At Fort Lyon, Captain Hall seethed with rage and humiliation as he penned his report. The ambush had been executed with professional precision, a style he recognized. His former Sergeant Luke Carter had to be involved. Hall began drafting orders for a major operation, requesting reinforcements from other posts. He would crush this rebellion and personally see Carter hang for his treason. Back in the Lakota camp, Luke worked late into the night with Standing Bear and the war chiefs, planning their next moves. The army would respond with overwhelming force, but the Lakota now had the tools to fight back effectively. Luke studied the crude map he'd drawn, marking possible ambush sites and escape routes. Everything depended on using their new capabilities wisely. Charlotte Nelson, the young schoolteacher in Pueblo, watched with growing unease as more army units arrived daily. The peaceful coexistence between settlers and natives was unraveling. She'd heard rumors about the white man living with the Lakota, teaching them to fight. Some called him a traitor, others a hero. Charlotte wondered if he understood the forces he'd unleashed. Luke spent hours drilling with the warriors, refining their skills with captured weapons and tactics. Many of the younger men now spoke passable English, learning military terms and commands. He knew they were creating something unprecedented, a fighting force that combined native stealth and horsemanship with modern infantry tactics. The question was whether it would be enough to survive what was coming. The spring rains turned the plains to mud, but Luke saw it as an opportunity. Heavy cavalry would struggle in these conditions, while the lighter-mounted Lakota warriors could move swiftly across familiar terrain. During one particularly wet morning, he gathered the tribe's leaders in a makeshift war council, spreading his maps across buffalo hides as thunder rolled in the distance. The federal troops' supply lines would be vulnerable now, stretched thin across sodden ground. Charlotte's schoolhouse had become an unofficial gathering place for concerned citizens of Pueblo. She listened as Nathan, the town's sheriff, described increased tensions with local ranchers. Some were sympathetic to the Lakota's cause, while others demanded military action. Through her window, she could see cavalry patrols growing more frequent, their blue uniforms stark against the muddy streets. The town was becoming an armed camp. In the Lakota camp, Luke worked to blend traditional hunting skills with military precision. Warriors who could track buffalo across vast distances now learned to read terrain tactically, identifying choke points and firing positions. The older men were skeptical at first, but seeing their sons master these new techniques gradually won them over. Luke found himself increasingly drawn into their world, learning their language and customs, even as he taught them modern warfare. Word reached them through friendly traders that a major supply convoy was planning to move through Paradise Valley, carrying ammunition and provisions for the growing military presence. Luke recognized the opportunity but also the risk. A successful raid would prove their capabilities but might trigger a massive response. The tribal elders debated through 2 nights before reaching their decision. The plan required perfect timing and coordination. Luke divided the warriors into 3 groups, each with specific roles. The first would create a diversion north of the valley, drawing off cavalry escorts. The second would block the convoy's retreat, while the main force struck from concealed positions along the ridgeline. They rehearsed at night, using torch signals and owl calls to coordinate movements. Charlotte noticed increased activity at the military camp outside Pueblo. Through careful conversation with soldiers who visited the general store, she learned of the supply convoy's route. Her conscience warred with itself. Warning the Lakota might prevent bloodshed, but it would mark her as a traitor. Late one night, she penned a coded message and entrusted it to a sympathetic Ute trader. The message reached Luke just in time to refine their plans. The convoy was larger than expected, with additional security added at the last minute. He modified their strategy, spreading warriors thinner but positioning them more strategically. The younger men were eager for battle, but Luke recognized the haunted look in their elders' eyes. They understood the true cost of what was coming. Rain fell again the night before the ambush. Luke lay awake, listening to droplets on leather hides, remembering similar nights during the war. He deserted to escape such violence, yet here he was, planning another battle. But this time felt different. He was defending a people's right to exist on their own terms, not fighting for abstract political causes. Dawn brought heavy fog to Paradise Valley, perfect conditions for their plan. Luke watched from his position as the convoy's lead wagons appeared through the mist. The wooden wheels struggled in the mud, exactly as he'd predicted. He waited until the entire column was committed to the narrow passage, then raised his arm. The signal fires blazed to life along the ridgeline, and the valley erupted in controlled chaos. The convoy guards never stood a chance against the coordinated assault. Shots rang out from multiple directions as mounted warriors emerged from the fog like spirits. Luke's training proved its worth. Instead of the traditional head-on charge, the Lakota fighters maintained discipline, picking off key targets and gradually tightening the noose. Within an hour, the entire convoy was under their control. Back in Pueblo, Charlotte heard the distant gunfire and prayed she'd made the right choice. The town was already changing. More soldiers arrived daily, and tensions rose between different factions. She understood that this raid, regardless of its outcome, would mark a turning point. The peaceful plains she'd known were transforming into something new and uncertain, shaped by the choices of people caught between 2 worlds. The captured supplies would change the balance of power in the region, But Luke knew they'd also triggered an inevitable response. As they redistributed the weapons and ammunition among the tribal warriors, he began planning their next moves. The Lakota had proven they could fight on equal terms, but survival would require more than just military success. They needed to show they could defend their territory without becoming the very thing they fought against. The late summer sun beat mercilessly upon the open plains outside Pueblo, as Luke Allen crouched behind a cluster of sun-bleached rocks, his borrowed Lakota bow steady in his calloused hands. Months of living among the tribe had transformed the former Union soldier into something entirely different. Neither fully white man nor native, but a bridge between two worlds locked in an endless cycle of violence. Below him, in the shallow valley, the Federal Cavalry Patrol moved with mechanical precision, their blue uniforms stark against the golden grass. Nathan Carter, the Lakota warrior who had first found Luke half dead in the creek bed 6 months ago, pressed close beside him. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, training the tribe's hunters in the guerrilla tactics Luke had learned during his time in Tennessee. The cavalry's predictable patrol routes had made them vulnerable, and now 30 Lakota warriors lay in wait, their positions carefully chosen to funnel the soldiers into a deadly trap. The plan was unlike anything the tribe had attempted before. Not a direct charge or raid, but a calculated series of attacks designed to demoralize and confuse. Luke had shown them how small groups could wear down a larger force, striking from multiple directions before melting away into the landscape. It went against their traditional ways of warfare, but Chief Joshua had seen the wisdom in adapting to survive against the ever-expanding military presence. Eleanor Lopez, the half-Mexican healer who had nursed Luke back to health, watched anxiously from the ridgeline above. Her heart was torn between her growing feelings for the deserter and her loyalty to the tribe that had taken her in as a child. She knew this battle could change everything, either securing the tribe's future or bringing down the full might of the army upon them. Her fingers worked nervously at the medicine pouch around her neck as she waited for the signal. The cavalry patrol drew closer, their horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. Captain Isaac Hall led the column, his stern face betraying no hint that he suspected anything amiss. Luke had crossed paths with Hall during his military service. The man was methodical, rigid in his thinking, and utterly devoted to his mission of pacifying the territory. It made him dangerous, but also predictable. The captain's very nature would be used against him today. The first arrow took Hall's lieutenant clean from his saddle, the shaft piercing his throat with deadly accuracy. Before the soldiers could even register what had happened, more arrows rained down from 3 different directions. Horses reared in panic, throwing their riders as war cries echoed across the valley. Luke's heart pounded as he loosed arrow after arrow, each shot guided by months of patient instruction from Nathan and the other hunters. The soldiers attempted to form a defensive circle, but carefully placed rock slides, triggered by hidden ropes, sent horses stumbling and broke their formation. Small groups of warriors emerged from the grass only to disappear again, striking from new angles before the soldiers could effectively return fire. It was chaos by design, each movement choreographed to increase the cavalry's confusion and terror. Luke had seen similar tactics devastate better-trained units during the war. Captain Hall bellowed orders, trying to rally his men, but the psychological impact of the attack was already taking its toll. Soldiers fired wildly at shadows in the grass, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions. The Lakota warriors moved like ghosts, using every fold in the terrain to their advantage. Luke caught glimpses of Nathan leading one group in a lightning-fast attack before vanishing again, the tactics they had practiced executed with deadly precision. The battle reached its crescendo when 3 warriors mounted on paint horses burst from cover, charging directly at Hall's position. The captain raised his revolver, but before he could fire, Luke's arrow found its mark, not killing the man, but pinning his gun arm to his saddle. The message was clear. The Lakota could have killed them all, but were choosing not to. As Hall's blood soaked into his uniform, the remaining soldiers began to retreat in disarray. Eleanor rushed down to help with the wounded, moving between friend and foe alike. Luke watched her work, remembering how she had once tended to his own injuries with the same calm efficiency. The tribe had taken only minor casualties, scrapes and bruises mostly, while the cavalry had lost 6 men dead and many more wounded. But it was the psychological victory that mattered most. The army would be forced to reconsider their approach to controlling this territory. Chief Joshua surveyed the battlefield with quiet satisfaction, nodding to Luke in acknowledgement of the strategy's success. But Luke's attention was drawn to movement on the far ridge, riders approaching from the direction of Pueblo. Through his borrowed spyglass, he recognized the lead rider as Caleb Nelson, the Indian agent who had been pressing for the tribe's removal. The real test was about to begin, as word of this defeat would soon spread throughout the territory. The aftermath of the battle brought unexpected consequences. Rather than immediately calling for reinforcements, Captain Hall requested a parley. Luke watched from hiding as Eleanor acted as interpreter, her clear voice carrying across the valley as she translated between Hall and Joshua. The captain had seen something that day that changed him. The possibility of a different kind of relationship between his people and the Lakota. Whether his superiors would share this revelation remained to be seen. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as Luke and Chief Joshua watched Nelson's approaching party from their concealed position in the rocky outcropping. The Indian agent's face was twisted with barely contained fury as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle. Abandoned supply wagons, scattered equipment, and the clear signs of the cavalry's hasty retreat. Eleanor stood tall beside Joshua, her presence a silent reminder of the bridge that had been built between their peoples. Captain Hall's parley had yielded an unexpected temporary truce, but Nelson's arrival threatened to unravel everything. Luke could see the calculation in Joshua's eyes as the chief weighed their options. The tribe had proven they could defend themselves, but sustaining a prolonged conflict would exact a terrible toll. The guerrilla tactics Luke had taught them would only work for so long before overwhelming force was brought to bear. "They'll send more soldiers," Luke murmured, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But we've shown them the cost will be high." Joshua nodded slowly, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Below them, Nelson was engaged in heated discussion with Captain Hall, their voices carrying faintly on the wind without the words being distinct. Eleanor moved closer, her shawl pulled tight against the growing evening chill. "Nelson has orders from Wichita," she said quietly. "He means to force the issue, one way or another." Luke's hand tightened on his rifle, but Joshua placed a restraining hand on his arm. The chief had not survived this long by acting rashly, and Luke forced himself to breathe slowly, calming his instinct for immediate action. The sun had nearly set when Nathan appeared silently beside them, his young face grave. "Riders coming from Pueblo," he reported, "but not soldiers." This news brought Joshua to his feet, and through the spyglass Luke could make out a small group of civilians approaching, led by a familiar figure, Caroline, the merchant's widow, who had often traded fairly with the tribe. Behind her rode several prominent ranchers from the region. Understanding dawned as Luke watched the new arrivals join the tents gathering below. Caroline's presence was no accident. She represented the growing number of settlers who had come to see the Lakota as neighbors rather than enemies. Her trading relationships and Eleanor's patient diplomacy had built connections that went beyond simple commerce. The night air grew colder as voices drifted up from the impromptu council. Luke could see Nelson's gestures becoming more animated as Caroline and the ranchers spoke in turn. Captain Hall stood slightly apart, his posture suggesting he was listening intently rather than participating. The fate of the region hung in the balance as two visions of the future clashed in the gathering darkness. Dawn broke over the valley to find Luke and Joshua still at their observation post, though the council below had dispersed hours earlier. Eleanor approached with a pot of coffee and news that made both men turn sharply to look at her. "Nelson's orders have been superseded," she announced, a small smile playing at her lips. "The ranchers have petitioned the territorial governor directly. They're arguing that stable relations with the tribe are essential for the region's prosperity." Luke let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't a final victory. There would always be those who wanted the tribe's land. But it was a beginning. The alliance they had forged through blood and trust had opened a door to something new. Joshua's people had demonstrated they could not be simply pushed aside, while their supporters had shown there was another path forward. As the morning sun warmed the valley, Luke watched Caroline and her group departing toward Pueblo, while Nelson and his men turned reluctantly toward Wichita. Captain Hall remained behind, deep in conversation with Joshua and Eleanor. The battle had been won not just with guerrilla tactics and clever ambushes, but with the slower, harder work of building understanding between peoples who had seen each other only as enemies. Looking out over the peaceful scene, Luke felt the weight of his past choices lifting slightly. He had deserted one war only to find himself in another. but here he had helped create something rather than destroy it. The Lakota had given him shelter when he needed it most, and in return, he had helped them find a way to defend their home without losing hope for peace. As Eleanor's laughter drifted up from below, Luke allowed himself to believe that sometimes the best victories came not from the barrel of a gun, but from the courage to imagine a different future. The final battle unfolded at dawn, as Luke Carter watched from the ridge alongside Nathan Hall and the Lakota warriors. After months of preparation, their intricate plan was about to be tested. Below, the Federal cavalry column snaked through the narrow valley, their blue uniforms stark against the golden prairie grass. Luke's heart pounded as he remembered how far they'd come since that desperate day he'd stumbled into the Lakota camp, a deserter with nothing left to lose. The signal came, 3 sharp whistles cutting through the morning mist. The Lakota warriors moved with practiced precision, exactly as Luke had trained them. Rolling boulders crashed down the hillside, splitting the cavalry column in two. Panic erupted as horses reared and soldiers scrambled for cover. But this was only the beginning of what Luke had planned with Chief Isaac Nelson's blessing. Charlotte Lopez crouched in the tall grass with her bow drawn, just as Luke had shown her during those long training sessions. Her father had opposed her learning these warrior ways, but Chief Isaac had supported her choice. Now she and the other young hunters would prove their worth. When the second signal came, their arrows found their marks with devastating accuracy, taking out the column's officers first. Another tactic Luke had insisted upon. The Federal soldiers' discipline began to crack as they realized they were caught in a carefully orchestrated trap. Luke had studied their tactics during his years of service, knew their weaknesses. The Lakota warriors emerged from hidden positions, attacking in waves just as he'd taught them. Not the traditional head-on charge, but a fluid strategy that left the cavalry unable to mount an effective defense. Joshua Allen, the cavalry captain, recognized the tactics being used against his men. These weren't typical Indian fighting methods. This was military strategy, adapted and improved. As his men fell into disarray, he caught a glimpse of a white man among the Lakota warriors. Understanding dawned in his eyes just before Charlotte's arrow found its mark. The battle shifted as the remaining soldiers retreated toward the perceived safety of a box canyon. Luke smiled grimly. They were playing right into the trap. Caleb Carter, Luke's brother who had joined them months ago after deserting his own unit, led the flanking force that would seal their fate. The familial bond between the brothers had only strengthened through their shared cause. Eleanor Nelson, the chief's daughter and now Luke's wife according to Lakota custom, coordinated the signal fires that guided their warriors' movements. Their union had initially caused tension in the tribe, but her father had seen the wisdom in combining their people's strengths. Now she stood as a bridge between two worlds, just as Luke did. The Federal soldiers found themselves completely surrounded, with steep canyon walls at their backs and determined warriors on all sides. Luke stepped forward, his voice carrying across the battlefield. He offered them the same choice he'd been given months ago: surrender and join with the Lakota, or face certain defeat. The soldiers' weapons lowered one by one as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Rose Hall, the tribe's medicine woman, moved among the wounded with her daughter Josephine, treating both Lakota and soldier alike. This too had been part of Luke's vision, not to destroy their enemies, but to transform them into allies. The old woman had been the first to truly understand what he was trying to achieve, had helped convince the tribal council to trust his plans. As the dust settled over the battlefield, Luke watched the integration begin. Former enemies shared water and bandaged each other's wounds. The victory wasn't just in defeating the cavalry column, it was in breaking the cycle of violence. Chief Isaac approached Luke, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You have given us more than new ways to fight," he said. "You have shown us a new way to win." The news spread quickly across the territory. A Federal cavalry unit hadn't been destroyed. It had disappeared, absorbed into the Lakota tribe. Other bands began sending observers to learn these new tactics. Luke and Eleanor's lodge became a place where both worlds met and learned from each other. The face of warfare on the plains was changing, and with it the balance of power. The last scene played out in Pueblo, where Captain Allen's replacement arrived to find his missing unit. But the stories he heard defied belief. Tales of sophisticated battle strategies, of soldiers choosing to remain with their supposed enemies, of a new kind of community forming on the plains. The official reports would never capture the true revolution taking place, one that had started with a single deserter who found his real purpose among the people he'd once been ordered to fight. Generations later, the story would be told around campfires, how Luke Carter and the Lakota had found a different path, how a battle had become a beginning rather than an end. The blood-stained plains around Pueblo became fertile ground for a new way of life, where the children of former enemies played together and old hatreds were gradually forgotten. It wasn't the end anyone had expected, but it was the beginning of something unprecedented on the American frontier. The legacy of Luke Carter's choice rippled through the decades that followed, transforming not just the plains around Pueblo, but reaching as far as Tucson and Wichita. His descendants, a mix of Lakota and settler blood, became respected mediators between worlds that had once seemed impossibly divided. The Carter-Lakota alliance evolved into a model for other communities, though few knew the full story of its violent beginnings. By the turn of the century, the trading post where Luke had first sought refuge had grown into a thriving settlement. The children of those original warriors who'd hidden him now ran successful cattle operations alongside the children of settlers, their herds grazing the same grasslands where battles had once raged. Eleanor, Luke's granddaughter, became known for breeding horses that combined the hardy traits of plains Mustangs with eastern thoroughbreds. The annual gathering at Pueblo drew people from hundreds of miles around, a celebration of peace that had emerged from conflict. Nathan's son, Joshua, now elderly but still sharp-minded, would recount how his father had been among the first soldiers to lay down arms and join the new community. The stories always ended with a reminder that courage sometimes meant choosing an unexpected path. In Durango, where some of the original cavalry unit had settled, the town museum displayed artifacts from that transformative time. A cavalry sword alongside Lakota medicine bags, photographs of mixed families working the land together. The curator, Rose Carter, Luke's great-granddaughter, had made it her life's work to preserve the true history of how peace had come to the plains. The cattle drives between Pueblo and Wichita became famous not just for their size, but for their crews. Mixed teams of cowboys whose easy camaraderie showed how far things had come. They followed trails blazed by their grandfathers, but instead of war cries, they shared songs that blended cavalry ballads with Lakota melodies. Caroline, who ran the largest ranch in the territory, made sure every drive included both native and settler cowboys. The old guerrilla tactics that Luke had taught found new purpose in protecting the herds from rustlers. The descendants of those original warriors became legendary for their ability to track and recover stolen cattle, their skills now used to preserve rather than destroy. Isaac's grandson led a particularly effective group that ranchers from Tucson to Wichita would call upon when trouble arose. The plains themselves seemed to remember, with certain meadows still bearing the names of those who had fought and died there. But now they were places of gathering rather than conflict, where the annual horse races drew competitors from both cultures. Caleb's Creek, named for one of the first cavalry soldiers to join Luke's cause, became famous for its healing waters, visited by both medicine men and doctors. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the community faced new challenges. Railroad companies, land speculators, and politicians who couldn't understand their way of life. But the strength forged in those early days of trust between Luke and the Lakota proved lasting. The children of both peoples stood together, using the combined wisdom of their ancestors to protect what had been built. Josephine, who taught at the local school, made sure every child knew the real story, not the simplified version in history books, but the complex tale of how trust and respect had grown from the seeds of conflict. Her classroom became a living testament to the community's unique heritage, with students learning both English and Lakota, studying both cultures' ways of understanding the world. Charlotte, the town's doctor, practiced a medicine that combined Western training with Lakota healing traditions, her clinic a testament to how the best of both worlds could work together. The herbs in her garden grew alongside conventional medicines, and her patients came from every background, knowing they would find healing that respected all traditions. The story of Luke Carter and the Lakota became more than just a tale of war and peace. It became a blueprint for possibility, showing how different peoples could forge something new without losing what made them unique. The plains around Pueblo, once scarred by conflict, now flourished with a life that neither side could have imagined alone, proof that the bravest battles are sometimes fought not with weapons but with the courage to trust. As the old century faded and a new one dawned, the legacy lived on in the daily lives of those who called the plains home. The cattle still grazed where warriors once rode, but now they were tended by the united descendants of both sides, their shared future as vast and promising as the open prairie itself.